We've just been through a period where we've introduced an enormous amount of monetary and fiscal stimulus into the economy. The idea of MMT has been talked about, and there's a lot of questions as to was what we've just experienced MMT or not. So let's break it down and talk it through as much as we possibly can and sort of get to an understanding of what actually happened and what it means for the idea of MMT. Or just explain the theory of MMT as we understand it today.
The high-level theory of MMT, modern monetary theory, is that a government that borrows and issues in its own currency, that government's spending technically it will never be constrained by fiscal deficits. Essentially, fiscal deficits don't matter. What truly matters is if, for example, $5.6 trillion worth of spending is enacted, you shouldn't be worried about how am I going to pay for this because you can just create the money. What you should instead be worried about is there enough productive capacity in the economy to meet this $5.6 trillion of demand I just created with $5.6 trillion worth of supply so that there is not runaway inflation. The simple fact that the $5.6 trillion from the CARES Act to the American Rescue Plan were enacted with absolutely no discussion of how are we going to pay for this. There weren't revenue offsets, there weren't tax increases attached to that bill, there weren't future spending cuts attached to those bills. That definitely feels like MMT. I remember post 08, we were concerned, what if China just dumps all our treasuries because we're spending so much? There was no discussion of that this time around, not even worried about how do we pay for this. So it's the MMT type narrative is already factoring into the decision-making process for governments. I think that's key. The narrative this time around far different than the narrative was in 2008, and the spending was far bigger than it was. And when the US government has this much debt and this large of a deficit, there's an argument to be made that if deficits mattered for things like the US dollar or interest rates, they would have already mattered by now, and they're not. So we're kind of going to keep going with this until something breaks, most likely. Yeah, the argument that would be made is if this were truly MMT, not only would it encompass deficit spending with not necessarily any revenue offsets attached to it, but also there would be a very careful analysis before the spending was done to make sure that the economy had the productive capacity to meet this demand with supply so inflation could be avoided. Also, in a true MMT, holistic MMT framework, with this 5.6 trillion in spending, there would probably be triggers where 1, 2, 3 years out from the spending, if inflation were to run above X% based on some metric, then spending would have to be cut. That part, that certainly was not included in any of these bills.
And the inflation impact is how much of that is there was just too much money put into the system, and how much was it part of the virus where people couldn't go to work, so supply chain suffered?
Yeah, it was definitely both. I mean, you created a demand shock at a time when the economy was closed. And, the economy is closed. A lot of people could not work. So there was no way that we would ever be able to produce enough goods to meet this demand. A lot of it was bought from China, judging by our trade deficit, but they were also dealing with COVID and shutting down factories and things like that. So it would have been almost impossible to forecast with any accuracy how much inflation would have been generated from this 5.6 trillion in spending, given you would have had to forecast the slack within global supply chains. And I just don't think there's a government agency out there that has the capacity to do that.
So if we get a result of high inflation, does that mean MMT doesn't work?
Yeah. So on one hand, you would say, yes, this does show that the US government is currently not set up to carry out something like MMT, because there was no analysis of supply chain constraints, how much productive capacity the economy had to meet all this 5.6 trillion in demand. Also, it's been very difficult to for Congress to agree on things like tax increases. So, in an MMT framework, to think that Congress could very nimbly react to inflation data and raise taxes to slow inflation or cut spending to slow inflation, they clearly are set up to carry out the spending side. We've proved that. But in terms of actually implementing it and make sure it doesn't result in runaway inflation, we're just not prepared for that.
What do you think the narrative around government spending in the U.S. economy will evolve to?
Well, it certainly shows that, we just spent $5.6 trillion and there weren't really any significant near-term repercussions that you would traditionally see if you were a deficit hawk, which would be things like a rapid devaluation of the currency, treasury interest rates going materially higher, foreign governments that hold our treasury bonds, dumping them on the open market. None of those things happened. Now, that's not to say that if we keep going down this path, those things won't happen. But we kind of are in this situation where Congress is saying, well, I got away with that. If we just did 5.6 trillion, well, what's an extra 2 trillion? What's an extra 3 trillion? These are huge numbers. Each of these things are bigger than all of the stimulus enacted in 2008. So the entire narrative around how much is too much has just totally gone down the drain.
Well, that's a good summary. I think we can wrap it up there, and we'll come back to this. This is a big topic. I'm sure we'll have more info on this for future CAP STRAT, uncapped, or CAP STRAT market updates.